labour relationship abroad under imperialism were really from Britain, United States in particular, and they were really focused in the extractive industry and raw material sectors. If you read Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, he talks about sort of several characteristics of imperialism. He talks about monopoly capitalism, he talks about the domination of finance, he talks about the division of the world between an oppressor and oppressed nations, sort of the forerunner of the global north and south today. And he talks about the export of capital in raw material sector. Okay, he doesn't really analyse it. You could critique Lenin for that. It would be a little bit unfair because he was writing in the middle of the First World War, and then he went on to participate in the October Revolution, rather more than participate. But you can see that there's an issue here. The issue is the following. And it's and Luxemburg's classical work on imperialism, the accumulation of capital, in many ways complements Lenin. And if you take the best of both works, you begin to get a better composite picture, because in the final section of accumulation of capital, in actual fact, Luxemburg writes quite a lot about the impact of the expansion of capitalism on what was then in those days called the backward countries, or what Lenin might call the oppressed nations, and so on. And she uses quite a lot of material from the United States in terms of the genocide against indigenous peoples, and she uses quite a lot of material from South Africa. It's well worth reading what Luxemburg has to say about the British in South Africa. Okay, so she brings to a European audience a sensitivity, if you like, to the impact of the expansion of capitalism to the oppressed nations. I'm not saying Lenin was insensitive to it, it's just that he didn't directly write about it at that time. And then we come to a very interesting sort of issue, which is the following. Luxemburg talks about dispossession of peoples, and she sees this dispossession as being between the capitalist mode of production and pre-capitalist mode of production. Okay, that's her sort of model. And she in fact argues that capitalism needs this extraction from pre-capitalist mode of production in order to survive. And she bases her argument on a critique of a section of volume 2 of Das Kapital. Now, many orthodox Marxists have, in my opinion, rightly critiqued Luxemburg. She got the specific point wrong. But some people, even when they're wrong, have got more to say than other people when they're right, in the sense that Luxemburg did raise a very interesting point, which is, how do you, in value terms, or in the categories of Das Kapital, explain what was happening in countries like South Africa? Okay, and how does the value relationship relate to what was, as I say, oppressed or poor countries of the world? Now, again, it's another sort of interesting point. What Marx said in the Grundrisse, he says, when one society conquers another, there are three possible outcomes in terms of the mode of production. The first outcome is that the mode of production of the conquering society is imposed on the conquered. I mean, this is sort of logical, right? The second is that, in actual fact, the conquerors are forced to adopt the mode of production of the society which they conquer. And he gives the example of successive invasions of India or something like that to explain what he's saying, right? That the inertia of the existing mode of production means that the conquerors cannot overcome it. They are forced to assimilate in a new political form existing social relations. And then he says, but thirdly, you can have a fusion of the two and a new type of society emerging. And I think Luxemburg's mistake is that she saw, in the case of South Africa and by extension other countries, two modes of production coexisting and the one sort of leeching off the other. Whereas in fact, I think what happened in South Africa, and I'll go on to try and argue and explain this, is a new fusion, a new type of social relationship. And this new type of social relationship, in terms of the capital wage-labour relationship, is no longer, as Marx argued in Das Kapital, a relationship between capital and free wage labour. Now, of course, Marx is full of full of qualifications, explanations of free wage labour, frees and heavily in inverted commas, but nonetheless he's very much emphasising that this is different to the tide labour of feudalism, that violence doesn't directly enter into the mode of production. Now what I say is that history took another turn after Marx wrote Das Kapital. And what you see in South Africa very plainly, and we'll see if anybody wants to deny it, right, is a reintroduction of violence directly in the mode of production. Okay? And this takes a form of national oppression. So what you have is sort of like a colonial capitalism, which is not the same as capitalism was in Europe. You have unfree wage labour. You have nationally oppressed wage labour, which is forced to sell, labourers are forced to sell their labour power on worse terms because of their national oppression. So what you have is a sort of a refocusing of the unity of oppression with exploitation, which in many ways it became separate in the richer countries. So what you get is a dispossession of the existing peoples of South Africa, but also their proletarianisation. I mean, what Luxembourg captured was the dispossession, but not the proletarianisation. So in fact, what you get is a reproduction of national oppression, not between one mode of production and another, but within one mode of production. This is part of the transformation of capitalism to imperialism. You have a structural relationship of national oppression within the capitalist mode of production. Okay? I'm not saying that it wasn't there before, especially from Britain. We had the slave trade, we had the robbery of all over the world and so on. But this was a different form of articulation of national oppression with the mode of production. Okay? Because what the point I keep coming back to is you've got a relationship between, if you like, British capital and African labour. Okay? So it's structured into the capital relationship. There's also national oppression. If we look at the particularities of South Africa, and there's very good literature on this. I mean, South Africa has got advantages and disadvantages, to use as an example. The advantages, there's quite a lot in English coming from the South, and a lot of material, I'm sure, which is written from the global South, just isn't available to us unless we read Spanish or Portuguese or whatever other languages, right? The other reason that it's important is because concretely, as Lenin rightly argues, the war, the Boer War, the war between the United States and Spain were the hinges of the change right at the beginning of the 20th century to imperialism from capitalism, right? So in actual fact, we should look at what was happening in countries like Latin America, Caribbean and South Africa at this moment of pivotal change. And in the case of the Boer War, it's a very interesting connection between the militarism of imperialism and the giving birth to a new type of wage labour capital relationship. It's very closely connected. Okay, so what's the theoretical challenge? There's two, right? There's two challenges. The first is this. If you want to understand natural resources and how in a capitalist society the exploitation of natural resources fits into the economic system, you have to read an awful lot of Das Kapital. It's kind of like a bit of a long course. You have to get to one of the later parts of volume 3 of Das Kapital, and so many people don't get there, right? But in actual fact, we need to get there. We need to raise our cultural level in order for Marxists to have a fairly strong grounding in Marx's conception of ground rent. And I'm very briefly going to explain what this conception is, and then try and explain how this relates to the first phase of imperialism and imperialism today. Okay. And then the other area which I mentioned is super-exploitation. I mean, when I started this, I thought, okay, what we can do is look at volume 3 of Capital and see how capital applies to imperialism, right? But the more I looked at it, the more I realised, in actual fact, we have to rewrite Capital, which sounds an enormously pretentious thing to say, but that's sort of like the conclusion that we'll come to, right? If you look at Marx's theory of rent, he distinguishes analytically between three different cases, okay? And he starts off with a case